All right, we're going to record on this computer. We're going to get Noam Chomsky to come, and hopefully he could see the transcript on the bottom. And we're going to go through all these topics together. All right, so I hope everything works. I'm going to enunciate clearly because he's hard of hearing a little bit, but he's sharp of mind. So that's what we're going to do. Plus, new facial hair. I like it. Sorry for all the artifacts of Zoom. I don't have a green screen behind me, so you're going to get this. The amazing disappearing hand. Fingers. And yeah. I'm just going to wait for him to join. I'm going to explain to him, hopefully, that this time around, we're going to need about 3 minutes. Oh, there he is. Oh, we're just getting the video set up. Hi, Noam. I can't hear you yet.
You can't hear me?
Now I can hear you, but I don't see you.
Yeah, so what do I have to do? Start video?
Start video. Yeah, there you are. You look great. Yeah, I see you.
I don't see myself.
You don't see yourself because I'm going to be sharing the screen. Most of the interview this time will mostly be a discussion, and I want to show the latest news.
Okay, do you have the live transcription?
Yes. Can you request the live transcription, or do you see it?
Okay, I see it.
Okay, fantastic. So
yeah, got it.
Last time we ran out of time. So this time I want to please ask you, we're going to have a discussion, like 50-50 time. And that's because I just need to get through all the topics. I'm going to give you about 3 minutes every time to just tell me whatever your reaction is and what you think. All right? So I just want to make sure that we...
going on. Don't hesitate to interrupt.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to start in like 30 seconds or so. Is there anything you want me to say or introduce you anyway? I'm just going to say.
Nothing special.
Okay. All right. So we're here with Noam Chomsky. I don't think the man needs any introduction. I will just say by way of really quick intro that Noam has been in politics for now how many years? 60, 70, 80, which is something very, very few people can say. And he's also written a famous book among many of his called Manufacturing Consent, about how the media is shaped by processes in our political system. So we're going to, of course, touch on many topics today, but we begin with something that is, I think, very heartening and actually good news. Just today, Russia and Ukraine have reached a deal. They have reached a deal to get grain out to people who might otherwise starve. There are millions of people around the world that are not being talked about as a consequence of this irresponsible war. The war might actually hurt more people outside of Ukraine even than inside. We're talking about Yemen, where the United Nations says is a step away from starvation for millions of people. We have essentially this conflict's been going on for longer than the Ukraine conflict, probably, and not as many people talk about it these days, but there have been some improvements and some hope there as well. Saudi Arabia proposes a peace deal. One of them is unblocking the airport. The rebels said that should not even be a bargaining chip, and so on. So Noam, what is the current state? Do you have any hope, at least for the famine? Do you see that this will, do you see this as a positive thing that the United Nations and Turkey has been able to accomplish? And will it mean removing mines, landmines or sea mines to get the grain out? What do you see from this?
Well, so far it's narrow. It doesn't involve land mines or even the sea mines. Part of the agreement is that the Ukrainian Navy will steer ships so as to avoid the mines that they have information about their mines. It won't have an effect for several weeks, but so we're really not sure how how it will be implemented or if it'll be implemented, but it is a very positive sign. Turkey, for once, is playing a positive role, and the United Nations is essential. It's the core of the process, and it's if this goes through, it'll be very significant. There are literally tens of millions of people facing imminent starvation if the whole Black Sea region continues to be cut off fertilizers as well.
Do you see any hope to end the Yemen conflict, which the United States and UN have been trying to end for years? And seems that just like with the Russia-Ukraine conflict and others, there's always people who are saying this is not enough. There are war hawks saying forget the whole diplomacy thing. How do you do you see any light at the end of the tunnel for either of these conflicts at the moment?
Well, I think there's a long way to go in Yemen, but it's the right direction. I mean, in any of these conflicts, either you move towards diplomacy, which means end results that no one is totally satisfied with, but are better than the alternatives. That's the meaning of diplomacy. So either you do that, or you have war, disaster, horrors, starvation, destruction. Those are basically the choices in Ukraine as well.
It seems that Minsk too, and we're going to talk about the timeline of events in Ukraine, and we're going to see some videos to react to. But before we get to diplomatic agreements that could have maybe been implemented since 2014, I want to talk about the media. Okay, one of the things that you consistently have been calling out is the media. And I find it very interesting because there are elements both on the left and now on the right, ever since, let's say, the last 10 years, including especially with Donald Trump supporters, who distrust the media for various reasons. But what's more interesting to me is that even more than Democrats and Republicans, when you have media propaganda for a war propaganda, you're going to get a lot of fake news. So I want to play this. This is a show mostly on the left. It's called Rising. This is Kim Iverson, and this is what they say about the current state of the media here.
CNN never made that claim. So you have to go in,
right,
endlessly, exhaustively research this stuff to see what you see. Is it real?
Well, social media is just so unreliable in situations exactly like this. In breaking news, crises, natural disasters, war, you can't trust what you see at all. And you're right to point out that this exact thing is happening on the pro-Russian side in Russia. But that doesn't mean we're not a responsible journalist should absolutely call out the kind of misleading or even deliberately misleading in some cases, to the extent it's trying to be a kind of propaganda.
Right, and what's so dangerous is that this is taking an ancient phenomenon and then layering on top of it, social media and video. There's that famous phrase that I just looked up who said it. It was Hiram Johnson, Republican. It could be our trivia. Hiram Johnson, progressive Republican senator from California. So the first casualty of war is truth. He said that about 100 years ago. And that has been a phenomenon that has been consistent in wars, throughout human civilization, that the conflict and the emotion just end up leading to a blanket inability of people to accurately relay what just happened.
I'm going to pause there. So what do you think is the ability of the media, the way it's set up today, whether it's the BBC, government, public media, NPR on the one hand, or whether it's privately owned media like Fox News or Ted Turner's CNN? What do you see as the ability for these institutions to bring us the kind of information that we can make sense of without essentially biasing us completely one way or the other? What do you think today? Do we have any hope for that?
I don't think it's very different from the past. In fact, in many ways, better than the past. Lots of journalists have gone through the experiences of the 60s and the 70s, which considerably civilized the society. It's affected them, have a wider range of opinions expressed. Lots of what appears in the media now you could never have said years ago. It doesn't mean that that there's no shaping and control. Of course there is. Reporters and journalists themselves, people on the ground, have in the past and continue today to do mostly courageous and honorable work. As it gets selected, reframed, modified through the editorial processes, certain things come out, other things disappear and are changed. Well, that's always been true. It's true now. You can, if you want to understand what's going on in the world, you have to start with the major media. First thing I do in the morning is read the national press. Then you think about what they're saying, what they're not saying, look at other sources, try to compensate for the modifications, choices, selectivity that comes in through the nature of the media. But that's just saying the media to send us fake news is not very, it's not, first of all, it's not true and not very illuminating.
I would say that two things happened in the last 20 years that have completely changed the media landscape since you wrote the book, Manufacturing Consent. Those two things I want to talk about. One of them is social media, the rise of Facebook, Twitter, and the ability for people to reshare articles very easily with each other. So with the ease by which they reshare articles, it starts to select for the types of articles that bring the most profit to Facebook or Twitter, which is typically outrage, echo chambers, meaning you get an article saying the other side did something bad, and you reshare that because you have outrage and you want others to know, look at this thing they've done. That's one. The other one is, and I'll talk about it a little later, but I want to talk about social media for a second. There was a Gallup poll that came out in July last week or so, and it said, this is from Gallup, Americans' confidence in newspapers and television news, well, it's been steadily declining since, you could see this, since 1972. And it's at an all-time low. Television news, 11%. Newspapers, higher, 16%, still very low. So whatever it is, they don't share your optimism about their source of news these days. Why do you think that is?
Well, first of all, the Gallup poll, while doubtless correct, is quite misleading. And in fact, a good illustration of how choice and selectivity affect what you read. So the facts are correct, but it fails to add that the same is true of attitudes towards all other institutions. Overall, decline in faith and trust for institutions is very striking. Congress, President, Supreme Court, virtually everything, even by now, the wholly military. So yes, there has been a sharp decline and trust and faith of institutions and so on. I don't think this has to do with the media. It has to do with the social disorder and collapse that has been the result of the neoliberal programs of the last 40 years, which have torn the society to shreds, harmed people enormously. There are actually measures of that, and have left people angry, resentful, loss of faith in everything, easy prey to demagogues because of the collapse of institutions by which people can defend themselves, like labor unions, which were the main ones in the past. All of this social disarray and decline has affected attitudes towards the media. But I think we should try to rise above that and ask, what about the media themselves? Well, let's turn to, say, Facebook. Polls show that, I don't remember the numbers, but a huge number of young people get their news from Facebook. What are they getting? Facebook doesn't have bureaus in Berlin, in Karachi. They don't have reporters on the ground. Facebook is selecting and filtering news that is presented by the major media. They're not a news producer. And they're doing it, as you say, in a way that exactly as you said, in order to maximize their own profit. They want to ensure that the more hits something gets, the more it gets foregrounded. Okay, that's their business model. And it does have exactly the effect you described. It enhances outrage, anger, fear of the others. It drives people into self-reinforcing bubbles where they communicate with each other, nod to each other about how wise they are, but don't hear anything else and hear no either self-criticism or critical voices. Yes, that's one of the, and a lot of this is done quite consciously through bots. Massive use of technology to try to manufacture consensus, as one recent book puts it, by mass manipulation with a huge technological resources, many financial resources, to simply drive people into certain consensus support for typically one or another power system. That's a negative side of social media. There's also a positive side. It's a good phenomenon that people are able to express themselves more clearly, to look at, in principle, to look at different sources. You want to find out about, say, the war in Ukraine, you can look up Al Jazeera, foreign press, see what they're saying. You can get different perspectives. Unfortunately, very little of that is done. There's a lot of opportunities, but they're very rarely used. If you look at the preponderance of use, it's just essentially driving people into self-reinforcing bubbles, not thinking. And there is extreme selectivity, not only the media themselves, but in the further filtering that's done by the Google media and others. I mean, Google, for example, just by ordering priorities can have a big effect on what people see and use. Of course, that's true of advertising. They're not there to get you the best product. They're there to get you the product that most advertisers can pay for.
So I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's important for we the people to have platforms today that may have not been possible 50 years ago. So the other thing that I mentioned that changed in the last, I would say 10 years, 12 years, is the rise of citizen journalism and the ability for people to have these cell phones because now they have a camera, and this is an unprecedented time. Everyone has a camera that can record video. There are now drones that they can put, and in fact, most of the shots we saw of Mariupol from the sky were actually people putting out their drones. There are dash cameras on the in the cars that can record hours of footage. There are also security cameras. So I would say, and I would want to ask you, what if we had sites devoted to citizens organizing bottom up? So what I mean by that, and this is very much in the anarchist tradition, you sometimes say you're a fellow traveler of anarchists. A lot of people believe that if we only get the news from the government affiliated sources, like in Russia, there is TASS, for example. Ukraine has shut down a lot of opposition news as well, media. What if we were to get our video footage from essentially our brothers and sisters on the ground over there? In other words, what if there was a site that would allow people to put up, for example, bounties in cryptocurrency that can be cashed out anywhere, regardless of the governments? They would amass these bounties and pay for primary footage, video, direct eyewitness video to be uploaded, and nobody could take it down. It couldn't be censored. About the only thing that could be done with it is have the public make sense of it. So the definition of citizen journalism on Wikipedia, which by the way is collaboratively edited, is the following. Citizen journalism, also known as collaborative media, participatory journalism, democratic journalism, etc., is based upon public citizens playing an active role in the process of collecting, reporting, analyzing, and disseminating news. My question to you is, given the abilities that we have today with computer networks, can we have a nonprofit alternative like Wikinews, for example, or like the site that we are building and others, to source using the new technology that's in everyone's hands, more video? Because we have no idea what's happening right now in Sana'a, Yemen. We have no idea what's happening in Mariupol, and we have no idea what's happening in Homs, Syria after the horrific bombings, because only the Associated Press and people who are well connected are authorized to essentially take the news, whereas anyone can really produce these in a large quantity. So that's my question to you. Do you think there could be potential for people to organize without governments and big tech and big media creating the narratives for them to consume?
Well, how exactly do we organize with people in Syria, let's say, to have them produce videos of what's happening? How do we do that organization?
The first thing we would do,
I don't know how to contact people in Syria.
the first thing we would do is we would have a site where people demand to see certain videos out of a certain region, and they would pay for it. They would all pool their money in crypto, like Bitcoins or Ethereum, and they would pay out for the best video. They can run a contest of people who put the most informative video that covers the most in Mariupol. So we would see what's really going on in that during the war and also in the aftermath of it.
Well, first of all, I think to get people in Mariupol to join this is a little bit fantastic. But the thing that we would see on it's not that it's wrong, maybe it's helpful, but we can guess what we'll see. These systems would be overwhelmed by private corporations, which are in many different ways using different names, different sites and locations, would be flooding it all with their own propaganda. through bots and other devices. It's just impossible to stop that. So it's possible that can have some positive uses, but I don't think we should exaggerate the likelihood. Also, remember that suppose you want to find out, let's say, what's happening in Pakistan, where there are huge protests going on to opposing all connected with the overthrow of the Imran
Imran
Khan
Khan?
government.
Or
You
what?
really have to have journalists who know the situation. You can have individuals on the ground saying, here's what I see with my camera. But good journalists do better than that. They get to know the situation, know the people, know the circumstances. I don't say everyone does, but the best journalists do. And they give you the kinds of insights that would be very hard to reconstruct from individual postings.
One
I should
moment, but
say-
isn't that exactly the type of dynamic you criticize in your book, Manufacturing Consent? You call it access. When you revoke access to Kennedy because you, for example, report on his sexual escapades, or you revoke access, you're saying that dynamic helps the journalist to have some insight, but it also controls the journalist, because if they report the wrong way, then they lose that access. So isn't that a way of manufacturing consent by the government?
Well, I should say, first of all, that very few people have read that book. They've read the title and maybe the first chapter. If you go on in the book, a large part of it is defense of the media, defense of on-the-ground reporting against attacks on it by right-wing organizations like Freedom House. About a third of the book is devoted to that, saying the reporters on the ground did an honest, courageous job, brought out what was important. But of course, they did it within a framework of ideology that's common to the culture altogether. But the charges against them were mostly completely fraudulent.
Oh,
We
I'm not
went through
talking
that.
about the reporters on the ground or the rank and file police officers or people doing their job on the ground. In fact, I remember when the Fox News was reporting the Bush versus Gore election, the people on the ground, they had made a claim, and their own reporters the next day found that the claim was actually wrong and debunked. And they asked the higher ups, will we run the story? No, the story was buried. So yes, the people on the ground are doing valiant work and they're intrepid journalists, but the people selecting what news will happen are profit driven, or they're driven by their allegiance to a government. Like we have here on the Ukraine side, we have war fakes from early on, like Kiev, what is it? The Ghost of Kiev and others. But we also have on the Russian side bias to such an extent that even people's own relatives didn't believe things were as bad as their relatives in Ukraine were saying. So you can see firsthand in this war and others how governments are shaping it. Don't you think that maybe we should at least have an alternative? Maybe it works and maybe it doesn't, but at least have an alternative that's by the people and not just for the people, you know?
Except, as I say, I think it can be useful. But the illusion that it's going to be, that it's by the people will quickly be dispelled by concentrations of private power, exactly as we see with social media. The bot phenomenon, the distribution of fake sources, which make things look like the astroturfing type phenomena, all that's going to go on. I wouldn't stress just the government. It's basically private power that's involved, governments as well, but not just government. Actually, one of the things we've lost in the past generation, which is serious, is the loss of local media. You go back 10 or 20 years, there were very good local journals, Boston Globe, San Francisco Chronicle, Detroit Free Press, LA Times, had their own bureaus, in Washington, overseas, had very good journalists. You go to, say, the Central American Wars in the 80s. The best coverage of all was, I think, probably done by the Boston Globe, much better than the mainstream reporters. Well, those are very good, excellent journalists. And it happened that they were the shaping and controls that you got from the real major national media were much less in effect. Same was true, for example, in the first Gulf War. The major media were suppressing all sorts of things, but you were getting them from Long Island Newsday, Knut Royce and others who were doing a great job. But all that's been disappearing. Now you have almost nothing. Local newspapers don't even have bureaus in Washington, let alone overseas. They're running wire services and selections from the major media. That's a very sharp narrowing of sources of information. That ought to be cultivated. Actually, there are people working on that, like Bob McChesney, efforts to try to revive authentic local media. That could be combined with the kind of thing you're talking about. Local media can be in direct contact with people on the ground and can amplify what they're doing without the selective power of private concentrations, which will have try all kind of ways to overwhelm it. So that's a possible nexus that might develop.
All right, wonderful. So let me move on now to talk about the series of events in Ukraine, okay? Because a lot of people on the left haven't been happy with how you have been speaking in some of these interviews, but I know you always speak your mind. And so I want to go through with you and set the record straight of what you believe, okay, happened since 2014. I want to begin with talking about what we here in the United States call an attempted coup. And again, this is not something that demagogues or the public even say. This is something that the chairman of the Bernie Thompson, who is basically heading up the proceedings of this panel, this investigation into January 6th. They think that that was an attempted coup, and they're essentially saying had it been allowed to proceed further, they could have overthrown the government. That's their view. Here's my point. By that same standard, as the people on the left are applying to January 6th, we read about 2014, the Euromaidon protest. The night before the clashes, the right sector, which is a fairly extremist organization, called on all its about 10,000 people at the time, called on all its members to ready themselves for a quote peace initiative on the 18th of February. The Maidan's People's Union also urged all concerned citizens to take part in this peace offensive, etc. That morning, 20,000 demonstrators marched on the Parliament building as that body was said to consider opposition demands for a new constitution or government. So far, it's fine. It's like the Million Man March and so on. But then we have around 10 o'clock, the demonstrators broke through the police barricade of several personnel transport trucks, pushed the cordon of police aside. The clashes started after 24 demonstrators moved the police vehicle. At 10 o'clock, a member of parliament reported that police armed with shotguns had begun to attack and flash grenades and so on. Basically, as we continue, we start reading, and you could read this Wikipedia article, what is essentially a crowd, a mob going at the Parliament building. And of course, we know later that there was an overreaction to some extent. The police were called out the Berkut to hit the protesters, many of whom, also involved defenseless people. And this was a big, here we go. Following the warning, the police advanced on thousands of protesters in Independence Square with guns, water cannon, armored personnel carrier, basically the kinds of things that China does in Hong Kong any day of the week. They could do. Tents, now the protesters were burning things. My question is, all of this going on, how does it compare with January 6th in the United States? I know you called it a coup. I know people like Nigel Farage and others call it a coup. But at the same time, Ukraine has had other revolutions. It had the Orange Revolution, it had other things. How much of it was democratic to the extent of, for example, in Pakistan, when they protested against their government, and then Russia was called in and helped stabilize Pakistan's government. The Mujahideen were fighting. My question is sort of in general, how does this stack up in terms of violent overthrows versus people just rising up against a kleptocrat or something to that nature, of that nature?
Well, first of all, side comment, we may well disagree on what counts as the left. What you're calling the left, I would often call the far right, even if they call themselves left. It's a matter of what people say, not the label they put on themselves. But you covered quite a range of attacks on governments. I don't think there's anything general we can say about them. Each one has to be investigated on its own. You can have an attack on government that's progressive, that's trying to create more, overthrow autocratic structures, create more popular control. That can be the case. Or you can have an attack on government which is trying to impose an autocracy. There's no general comment to make about insurrections. But take January 6th. January 6th was a coup that was an effort to impose autocratic rule, to overthrow. We have a very limited democracy here, but something, it's not zero. And the limited democracy did provide an outcome. The attempted coup on January 6th was to try to impose a minority position by force to overthrow the moderately democratic result. That has nothing to do with it's very different than other uprisings. There's just no general comment you can make about all of them.
Well,
Each
here,
has particularities.
here in Ukraine, we saw that the right wing was largely on the side. You had right sector leader Dmitry Yarosh and others. They rejected reconciliation agreement that the political elites made with the public. And look, the whole thing started because Yanukovych was essentially in some ways a Russian puppet. He blocked an association agreement with Europe. Now, looking back on it, I'll tell you my own opinion. I think Ukraine there are several groups, just like other countries have several groups, like Shiites and Sunnis. In Ukraine, they have the pro-Russian people who elected Yanukovych, who, by the way, put Yulia Tymoshenko in prison. And then we have people on the anti-Russian side, let's say the Western side, or NATO side, who would like to sever relations with Russia. And they were very happy to use Berkut the other way to disenfranchise the pro-Russian side. So each side, whether it's Yanukovych trying to deny the association with Europe, or whether it's Yatsenyuk or Poroshenko, or in this case, Zelensky trying to outlaw associations with Russia, right? It seems that neither side will let the other just have free trade. And here's an interesting statistic: 11 million Russians have families in Ukraine. So presumably these people would want to have some association with the other. And I'm sure that they also have relatives in Poland, in the west of Ukraine. But it seems that these political factions will not allow the other to have anything, economic association, familial. There's not even direct flights. I was trying to get a flight from Russia to Ukraine and vice versa during 2018 football World Cup, and I couldn't do it. There was nothing. So in my opinion, this is what was exploited for essentially a proxy war. A proxy war is when an outside country exploits the political internal divisions, like with the Houthi rebels in Sa'ana, Yemen, and basically gives them weapons, gives them training, gives them hope that as long as they keep fighting, they're going to essentially win because they have this big group. And Russia has done that too. Russia has perpetuated, in my opinion, the conflict while it was doing these agreements. Yes, it also helped to fund Strelkov Girkin, who was the basically a radical. But this man here, sorry, I don't know if I can. Is that working? Strelkov was essentially, not officially, but he came to help the rebels. The United States does that too with Manuel Noriega, others. So that would be my take. I want to ask you, since this thing failed and Yanukovych ran, the essentially right-wing groups were very happy to remove Yanukovych. Then he disappeared. Then the Rada went to, in his absence, decided to create a new government, but they kind of violated their constitution in some way to do that. Does that justify Russia reneging on the Budapest agreements and everything else and deciding that they can just recognize Crimea as an independent thing? Is that something that you think Russia was justified to do just because Ukraine didn't follow its constitution in its regime change, if you will?
Well, you've raised about a dozen different points here, and I'm not sure which ones you want to talk about.
The last
you want
one.
to talk specifically the question of Crimea? Well, we understand very well why Russia moved to take Crimea. The developments that were taking place in Ukraine, which were quite complex, led to a situation in which Russia's single warm water port and naval base were being threatened. So Russia moved in to ensure that it would maintain control over them and that the Crimean Peninsula would be secure, meaning it would have access to water, which is a problem that would be survivable. There was a referendum under Russian control, which dubious, of course, but most observers thought it was probably fairly accurate, which indicated that most of the population preferred to join Russia rather than the new Ukraine that was developing. It wouldn't be particularly surprising. John Quigley, who's one of the specialists on the topic, in fact, he was the US State Department representative in the negotiations back in the early 90s to try to bring some order into the chaos that was developing out of the collapse of the Soviet Union. He was working specifically on Crimea, and he points out that there was just no question then that overwhelmingly at that point, the population wanted to be associated with Russia. How much that remained in 2014, you can debate. So that was what was happening. There's a lot.
By the way, just to support what you're saying, here on Wikipedia, 97% of the vote supposedly was the integration into the Russian Federation, 83% voter turnout, and very similar in Sevastopol, which was, my question is, why didn't they have more observers? Why don't they just allow more people? Isn't it in their interest currently in Donbass too, to have more observers? Why do they keep these people out? What's the point? To give themselves less legitimacy? Why did they do it?
Why did the Russians keep people out?
Yeah, why did the Russians not allow more people to observe? If you look at the non-OSCE observers, it says that
it's a brutal autocracy. They don't want people getting. They don't want people giving independent reports, even if the reports would support them. They're a tightly controlled, top-down system. They do a lot of things which I think are not in their interest even, but that's what you expect in dictatorships. Okay, we do a lot of things. Same is true of our leaders. I mean, why didn't they allow them in? I suppose because they don't want any sign of free and independent reporting, even if that reporting would support them. That's my guess about why they didn't do it. Now, there are a lot of other questions you can ask. For example, Russia claims that in the build-up to this invasion, late 2020, 2021, there was a sharp increase in Ukrainian attacks in the Donbass region. They've made many claims to that effect. There's general agreement that maybe on the order of 15,000 people were killed. Well, there are OSCE observers on the ground. They're giving regular reports of what happens. They don't draw conclusions. That's not their job. They just give reports. So you can ask, the Russians claim that this was coming from Ukrainian side. One question you can ask is, why don't they produce the evidence using the reports of the OSCE observers as a basis? Well, I don't know the answer to that. It may be that the evidence doesn't support them. Maybe that they don't want to allow independent evidence. You can guess what you want. But I don't see very much point in our trying to guess what's going on in the minds of a small a group of hard men around Putin who are trying to run things in their own interests.
Well, that's my point. And that's why I think we absolutely need citizen journalism with these phones, because we don't have to wait for these closed door meetings. Everything about this conflict going back 20 years is due to closed door conversations. Gorbachev claimed that he was told NATO would not expand an inch. There are people now that try to look for tea leaves and figure out what was said back then. There wasn't any, it's not public. In fact, even the peace deals, I personally was talking on Facebook with the peace delegation, okay? One of the guys, David Arachamia, okay? I was put in touch with him on Facebook. And many people begged on his page, please take this seriously, make some peace agreement in Belarus, right? One of the guys was killed actually by SBU, which is essentially the special, the CIA, you could say, of Ukraine. He was killed. He was on the delegation selected by the president, but then he was accused of being a spy. SBU would normally remove collaborators with Russia, just like Russia would remove collaborators with the enemy, or just like the self-proclaimed republics would do. To me, I'm basically saying that I think we need the people to have transparency, because if we keep having these closed door discussions, which they spent 2 hours, they didn't spend 8 hours. They took days to get to the event, and then they barely took it seriously, some of them. How can you trust these people to make any peace? It seems to me very strange. So I think the people need to at least be able to record videos for each other around the world. I really think that this will help. Because like you're saying, Russians don't even know what's going on, and neither do many Ukrainians. Their governments are lying to them a lot of the time. So can we agree that the internet can help people to connect and to share information without having to rely on top-down governments like we used to?
In some cases, yes. If you want to see that a shell is falling on a building, somebody on the ground can report it. You've touched again on a dozen different things. If we want to figure out if we want to find out what James Baker promised to Gorbachev, citizen journalism won't help in the least, not in the least. There's no citizens around. On that matter, we happen to have a rich array of internal documents which give us the answers to who said what to whom. You can find them in the National Security Archives. So that basically answers the question. But on some issues like what does it look on the ground? Yes, citizen journalism can help. Nobody's opposed to it. A lot of information about police violence, for example, has come from citizen journalism, to the point where there are now efforts to block people from taking videos of what's happening in a violent confrontation. So sure, we should all be in favor of that. Frankly, I don't think it's going to have a major effect on the way news is gathered, reported, filtered, shaped, because the impact of concentrations of power, mostly private power, will intervene, just as has been happening with social media. And it's very
But would
hard
you
to
also
block
agree,
that.
just a direct question to you. Would you agree that public concentrations of power in the hands of Mr. Putin or in the hands of Zelensky or any other person, MBS, do you not see that that power is already being used and has always been used to coerce the media as well, right? So can we give a chance to the other media? Sure, it might be corrupted by private concentrations of power, but this media has been controlled by public concentrations of power.
That's what the major media are. They're private concentrations of power. The major media are major corporations. They're influenced by government. They're linked to government because the whole corporate system is, but they largely reflect corporate interests. Wiping that out of the story is missing a lot. That's not Russia, where it's government controlled. We're not that. In fact, whatever. So, I mean, there's a complex array of factors that enter into a media performance. Advertisers, for example, make a big effect. The news that is filtered, say, by Google and Facebook is, in a substantial respect, advertiser-driven. It's not government. Yes, concentrated power, like Russia has perfectly obvious ways, controls and distorts the media landscape. That part is transparent. It's more complex when you move to a Western society that is not pure autocracy like Russia.
One thing that always bothered me, and I didn't understand what's going on, is the fact that Ukraine seems to have been trying to implement Minsk II. I understand that there's war hawks on both sides that say, you go first. No, you go first. You remove your, you disarm first. But here's the thing. You and many leftists have written open letters about this, and I want to bring this up to you. You have called for Ukraine to come to the table to negotiate with Putin. The fact is they have, and so did Putin. Belarus and France and Germany have tried really, really hard to get them together. They got them together in the Normandy format multiple times. They had multiple presidents on the Ukraine side, of course, because the Russian president is always the same here. But they essentially tried really hard to create an agreement. I would argue that Britain and the United States did very little to support the agreement and probably did a lot more, promising that if they didn't go for it, that they would be better off. But my question is, here we read, the Parliament of Ukraine approved a law on special status of Donbass 17th of March. I think we're talking 2015, as specified by Minsk II. Later in 2019, Ukraine's parliament voted to extend regulations giving limited self-rule to separatist-controlled eastern regions, a prerequisite for the deal. But somehow, this is the part that I don't understand. The law was immediately criticized by Ukrainian politicians, but also separatist leaders and the Russian government. It would seem that they should be happy. At least the separatists should be happy. They're getting self-rule and a prerequisite. So what happened to this? Nobody seems to even discuss this. Didn't they at least give it a try on the Ukrainian side?
Well, it's very difficult to respond to you because you give a list of couple dozen different points. They're all different. Each of them is questionable. I can start with the first. So you said, I've been trying to convince Ukraine to negotiate. Actually, I haven't said one word about that, not one single word. That's what you're reading on the so-called leftist sources you're looking about. It's not what I said. What I've been talking about is US policy. And what I've said is the United States, Britain behind it, have been acting to try to impede negotiations. And we should stop doing that. We should stop trying to undercut the diplomatic process. As for Ukrainians, they're going to have to decide for themselves what they want. If we look at it, I have discussed quite a lot these German and French initiatives, which are nothing anywhere near what you described. There were some importance, but they were very minor, limited. Putin, stupidly, in my opinion, rejected the French initiatives just flat out, and they were then withdrawn. By the time you get to the NATO summit a couple of weeks ago, France and Germany had completely withdrawn their limited negotiation offers. The Draghi also in Italy. There was a split in NATO for a time between the United States and Britain, which were adamantly blocking negotiations, and France, Germany, and Italy, which were tentatively, very tentatively, making some gestures towards a diplomatic settlement. And US power, actually Putin settled this by the invasion. He drove Europe into the US pocket. They pretty much withdrew their efforts. But that's a few of the points that you raised. There's many others.
But I do want to ask about the main point, which is that didn't Ukraine's Rada, the parliament of Ukraine, they approved a law on special status of Donbass right after Minsk II, and then in 2019 voted to extend regulations giving limited self-rule to these regions. Aren't they meeting the Russians halfway here? Shouldn't it be Putin that comes and then meets with Zelensky or whatever and fulfills his mandate? And this time Zelensky wasn't elected. I think it was still Poroshenko. But why did the Minsk II fail if right here we have the Ukrainians, the parliament approving it, giving separatist controlled regions self-rule?
There's even more than that. Actually, I've written a lot about this. I'm just repeating. But in 2019, Zelensky was elected with about 70% of the vote. It was a peace vote. He was elected on a program of trying to bring about a peaceful settlement with the eastern areas, basically. He made an effort to do this. He was threatened by far-right forces saying they'd kill him if he tried to implement anything like Minsk II. Well, if he'd gotten any US support at all, he might well have continued. That might have prevented the invasion. At that point, the Russian and Ukrainian positions were not very different. They were both talking about a federal arrangement in, yes, you've got the right thing up there. Stephen Cohen's one of the few people that talked about it, Russian specialist.
Is that where you're getting, is it based just on Stephen Cohen, or do you have other sources for this as well?
Well, there were plenty of sources which more or less supported it. Cohen was the most outspoken, and I think what he said is well established. There was a possibility. You take a look at the Russian and Ukrainian positions, they were not very far apart. Anatoliev and others have written about this, specialists on the area. They were all calling for some kind of a federal system in Ukraine, which would give considerable autonomy to the Donbass region. That's basically the Minsk II arrangement. Well, it failed. One of the reasons it failed, and the one that is most important for us is the US refused to give any support to it. And in fact, acted in such a way as to make it clear it didn't want it. At this point, starting in 2014, the US was pouring arms into Ukraine, advanced armaments, doing it through NATO, but it means the United States. Quite openly, they're bragging about it, in fact, carrying out joint military training, military operations, building up, in fact, turning Ukraine into what the US military journals called a de facto NATO partner. This went on right through this period when Zelensky was, with the peace mandate, was making some efforts to lead to what might have been a reconciliation within a federal framework.
So I just have 5 more minutes of questions, but I basically, I find that maybe you have some agreement with Trump supporters in this one. And you've even said that Trump was one of the only politicians that supports a diplomatic process. You've said that in some interviews. Tucker Carlson was famously, and Orban, who Tucker Carlson supports. All of these people talk about being America first, not being dragged into another war. And this is what Tulsi Gabbard had to say on Tucker.
Prevented this. And that is the thing that is most tragic about this heartbreaking situation with this war, is that it could have been avoided if President Biden and NATO had done exactly what you were just talking about in agreeing, hey, we're going to take NATO off the table for Ukraine, something that both the US and NATO have agreed is not likely to ever happen, and something that is a legitimate security concern for Russia, that they won't accept having US and NATO troops on.
I want to play one last video and then get your reaction. This is from 2019. This is Arestovich, who became essentially the Kellyanne Conway to Zelensky. He was a critic, but then he became an advisor. This is what he says. Just 1 minute, and then I would like you to react. This is he said in 2019. You can see can you see these captions? Here.
Да, мы можем говорить о каких-то сроках прекращения войны.
Нет, ни о каких сроках прекращения войны мы не будем говорить. Наоборот, это, скорее всего, подтолкнет крупные военные операции России против Украины. Потому что они должны нас будут просадить в инфраструктурном отношении и превратить здесь все в разваленную территорию для того, чтобы нас неохотно...
То есть Россия сможет пойти на прямую конфронтацию с НАТО?
Конечно, Россия, не НАТО. Мы не успеем. Они должны это сделать до того, как мы вступим в НАТО, чтобы мы не были интересны НАТО. Перестали быть интересны, как разваленная территория. С вероятностью 99,9% наша цена за вступление в НАТО – это большая война с Россией. А если мы не вступим в НАТО, это поглощение России в течение 10-12 лет. Вот и вся вилка, в которой мы находимся. А теперь давайте выбирайте Зеленского.
Подождите, теперь если поставить чашу на весах, а что лучше в таком случае?
Конечно, крупная война с Россией и переход в НАТО по результатам победы над Россией.
Что такое может быть крупная война с Россией?
Это воздушная операция, наступательное вторжение российских армий, 4, которые они создали на наших границах, там осада Киева, попытка окружить войска, которые в АТО находятся, операция Объединенных сил, прорыв через Крымский перешейк, выход на Каховское водохранилище, чтобы воду в Крым дать, наступление с территории Беларуси, там, создание новых народных республик, диверсии. Удары по объектам критической.
I'm going to stop it. Just say this guy perfectly predicted all of the Russian offensive in 2019 and said it was preferable to being economically and otherwise getting closer with Russia. Do you think they did this because of some US promises, or what do you? This is politicians essentially deciding for the people that they will live under bombs, I guess, but in the end, they will join NATO. That's what it looks like to me. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, again, it's impossible to give thoughts on a dozen different points. Okay, so if we go back to Tucker Carlson, which you started with, his position is the most insane of all. He says, we don't want to waste time on Ukraine. We want to get ready for a battle with China. So let's put all our resources into going to war with China. It's insanity. Okay, so maybe he, on the side, made some comment that happens to be sane about some topic he wasn't interested in. But if you want his position, you look at the whole thing, not one word. I did quote Trump because Trump happened by accident to, among his random productions, one of them turned out to be sensible. And the reason why I pointed that out, if you look at the context and what I said, was as a critique of everyone else. It wasn't praise for Trump. It said, Trump happened to say something sensible. He's the only one. Why aren't the rest of you saying it? That was picked up by what you call the left as a huge endorsement of Trump. I mean, we're talking about totally irrationality here. If you want to know about the prediction of a Russian invasion, you know, it was not very surprising. It was pretty clear that if the efforts at a diplomatic settlement failed, sooner or later Russia might just invade. Didn't take a genius to figure that out.
But it's still being called unprovoked, completely unprovoked. How is it unprovoked if it's perfectly predicted that this would happen and being necessary to join NATO by essentially the advisor to the president, right?
They were saying at that time that they were not intending to join NATO. Now it's different. Now they're calling for, as the conflict escalates, both sides take harder positions. That's also predictable. But if you go back to the pre-war position, the proposals that Zelensky was making were not very far from the Russian negotiating position. And if you look back at what I actually said, instead of what you're reading in the what you call the left media, I was criticizing the US media for failing to report Zelensky's diplomatic proposals. They were quoting his extremist, hawkish proposals, but suppressing the diplomatic ones, which was consistent with the US government line of trying to undermine negotiations. And that was a mistake. I thought at the time, in retrospect, I think it's clearer, there should have been serious effort to permit negotiations to proceed and to offer whatever support one could give when there were efforts at negotiations. It's on all sides.
But just to
So
be
when
clear,
Macron,
just to be clear, Zelensky's own advisors, like Arestovich, here in 2019 say that war with Russia is preferable, and 99.9% likely it's preferable because they will join NATO. This is literally what he is saying. So I think the aspiration is to join NATO and to make sure, right?
was he calling for joining NATO?
He was in favor of it strongly right here,
Совсем переход в НАТО по результату.
and joining NATO on the basis of victory over Russia. This was the plan, or at least this was the expectation of Arestovich.
I didn't see anyone in 2019 who was calling on, in Ukraine, who was calling on Ukraine to defeat Russia. But if somebody did that, they were crazy, of course. Okay.
Well, that's the advisor to the president of
But
Ukraine.
what Zelensky was proposing was not that. It was saying, let's put off any question of NATO. Let's move towards a settlement which will offer a degree of autonomy for Donbass within a Ukrainian federation. That was the official position. The US should have supported it instead of undermining it.
Well, yeah,
I'm
this
afraid
guy
I-
is like, yeah. Anyway, okay, so yeah, this guy was like, who was the guy who told Trump to invade Iraq? I forgot. Trump fired this guy. He was a big neocon who just wanted, he never met a word he didn't like. I forgot his name. Bolton, John Bolton. So this guy is like the John Bolton of Ukraine, essentially. He's saying that they should go to war because they're going to win and go into NATO. And Zelensky is like the Trump of Ukraine.
Well, if someone in Ukraine in 2019 said we should go to war with Russia because we can defeat them, he was out of his mind. Okay, I never saw such a statement, and it was different, was radically different from the official position. But of course, that statement would be crazy. Afraid I got to leave. Sorry.
All right, last question, 1 minute. This can lead, hopefully will not lead
Okay.
to nuclear war. I know you've been talking about nuclear Armageddon for a very long time, the nuclear clock, and we have Belarus asking for their weapons back, proliferation in Belarus. We have Iran saying that they, the Atomic Agency now says that they are able to race towards a nuclear Iran. And also South Korea keeps saying that North Korea is developing a nuke. What, I mean, do you think the world is as the closest it's ever been to huge proliferation and possibly someone will throw a nuke? You know, what's going on with the nuclear that's all I want to ask, because it seems that the United States keeps giving Ukraine bigger and bigger weapons. Most of them explode over Ukrainian citizens, the vast majority. But if some of them wind up in Russia, that could escalate and set off the some sort of tactical nuke in Ukraine. Hopefully not. Like, what is going on with all this nuclear madness, basically? Iran, Belarus.
I'm already late. I have 1 minute. In
Okay.
that 1 minute, I cannot talk about Iran, South Korea, Ukraine. That's impossible. Keep the Ukraine. I think we should particularly focus on what's being said here. What you can read, for example, in the Atlantic Council, high prestigious institutions, which you can read in you take a look at in formal government position. What it's basically saying is, let's take a gamble. Let's gamble with the people of Ukraine and with the world and see if we can escalate the war to the point where Ukraine will threaten, Russia will defeat. And let's hope that Russia will say, okay, we slink away in defeat and will not use the weapons that, of course, it has to devastate Ukraine. I think that's madness. Okay, gotta leave.
All right. Thank you very much, Noam Chomsky. Always a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was going to play this at the end.
This is how Russia rattles sabers. Testing a missile capable of carrying a nuclear weapon more than 10,000 miles, nearly twice the distance from Moscow to Miami.
Риски весьма и весьма существенные.
Russia's foreign minister recently called the risk of nuclear war considerable. And Russian talk shows have debated how quickly a bomb could reach Europe, even showing how one might create a nuclear tsunami.
I know that I don't normally do a monologue after someone leaves, but I think in this case, I didn't get through all the videos I wanted to play, so I'll just play them now. I love getting Noam Chomsky on a conversation. I wish I could let him talk longer. As you could see, this time I tried to keep it a 50-50 just so I could get through all the topics, and I got through about 75%. The world is constantly on the brink these days because of politicians that can't seem to get to the negotiating table. Super happy about this, essentially allowing grain to be shipped, allowing Ukraine to make money on it, allowing the resources of the world's breadbasket to be shipped out. Very happy about that. People need this, millions of people need this, but ultimately, you know, and by the way, in those regions, we need peace as well. You know, just because they are Muslim or non-European doesn't mean that they're Untermenschen or they don't count or something like this. You should care about the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world. And looks like this will help it. What I am been saying is that the war, during a war especially, media controlled by governments is going to put out all kinds of fake things, and truth is the first casualty in war. This has a variety of causes, and Noam is right that it's never that simple, but the fact is Americans have lost trust in institutions. And, this has been happening even when Republicans supported all the institutions, and it was the leftists who questioned all of the Patriot Act and all this stuff. So it's just, I think we, the people, need to organize. With the internet, we finally can. With this amazing hardware, ubiquitous cameras, we finally can. I think that's a big thing. We take back the narratives from the politicians, at least inform each other, because this is unacceptable. Having people in Russia not believe that their own relatives are being bombed at the same time. There's 11 million people in Russia that have families in Ukraine. And that's why we cannot let the sectarian strife, and yes, it is as sectarian as, as Houthi rebels and Sunnis and Shiites. We need the people to, regular people don't want war. Regular people don't want to kill each other. And that's true even of Russia, of Russians. It's the media that radicalizes people. It's the media, and I haven't got a chance to even get to Hamas in Israel, but there's radicalization. If you're living in an enclave like Gaza and you're essentially surrounded and you're given media by Hamas, right? And they're always talking about being a shaheed and a martyr and fighting for, and that's what you hear, then that is the value system that you're going to get. Similarly, if you hear about Moskali Russians in Moscow and how they are always killing and dominating Ukrainians, or if you're a Kurd and you're hearing about Turks, or you're a Catalonian and you're hearing about Spain and so forth. I think it's important for people to inform other people without centralized media and government. I can't get into it with Noam Chomsky very much because he seems to be for centralized media, or I should say big media and not big tech, but big media. I think that's because he may not understand how possible it is to decentralize things and how empowering technology can be. But maybe it's me who doesn't get it. I just think that these big corporations and these big governments have an outsized influence on our democracy. So Bitcoin, Ethereum, these represent glimpses of the kind of autonomous networks that can help us. I wish I had more time. This is really important. I didn't understand exactly what is it and how did the peace process go wrong. It seems that the parliament of Ukraine did take actions. And so something's going on. Why was the law immediately criticized by Ukrainian politicians? I can understand, but separatist leaders, Russian government, I don't understand. I don't get it why Russians were not happy. Representative of LDR says a one-sided modification of Minsk II. They wanted it all. People seem to, again, be hardline and don't compromise. And it's these people that derail multiple attempts by Belarus, France, Germany to bring about a peace. Look at this guy. They're right here. They could have done it here. They could have done it here. Okay. Look, Zelensky got elected. And look, Noam Chomsky's probably right. He's probably right about Cohen. Unfortunately, I haven't found many people agreeing with Cohen. Noam Chomsky has a knack for getting people who aren't out of the mainstream. I don't know, but this is certainly true, the mandate to make peace with Russia. What happened to that mandate? Well, you could see Zelensky going and talking to, okay, so you could see Zelensky with far-right elements. Now, it's not just Azov, it's like Dnipro and right sector, okay? Ukraine does have far-right elements. I wouldn't go to war with Ukraine over that. That's like going to war with the Taliban in Afghanistan, all right? So, I mean, the fact is, denazifying, Russia has a lot of Nazis or Nazi sympathizers in Russia. He can go denazify right there at home. So, this whole thing about denazifying was it incredibly bad messaging by Russia, incredibly bad. But it's sort of like us talking about how we're doing a crusade. Well, that was said by George W. Bush. He quickly backtracked on that and said, oh, we are bringing liberation or liberating them. Very similar language. We'll be greeted as liberators, said Dick Cheney. Again, these videos where they predict exactly what will happen, Dick Cheney, 1994, unbelievable. They predict everything is going to happen. They still go ahead and do it. In case anybody knows, this is the clip.
Do you think that the U.S. or UN forces should have moved into Baghdad? No. Why not? Because if we'd gone to Baghdad, we would have been all alone. There wouldn't have been anybody else with us. It would have been a U.S. occupation of Iraq. None of the Arab forces that were willing to fight with us in Kuwait were willing to invade Iraq. Once you got to Iraq and took it over, and took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? That's a very volatile part of the world. And if you take down the central government of Iraq, you can easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off. Part of it, the Syrians would like to have to the west, part of eastern Iraq, the Iranians would like to claim, fought over for 8 years. In the north, you've got the Kurds. And the Kurds spin loose and join with the Kurds in Turkey, then you threaten the territorial integrity of Turkey. It's a quagmire if you go that far and try to take over Iraq. The other thing was casualties.
Casualties, quagmire.
Everyone was impressed with the fact that we were able to do our job with as few casualties as we had. But for the 146 Americans killed in action, and for the families, it wasn't a cheap war.
I got to say, to me, as someone who values every human life equally, and I think Noam Chomsky is similar in this. It's really impressive to hear just how little we talk about millions of people. Like, for example, these millions of people that the UN talks about, millions of Yemen, a step away from starvation. But we talk about Khashoggi. Literally, that's the reason why it's bad to deal with Saudi Arabia or something like that. I have a serious problem with that. Same with Libya. If we go to Libya, failed state, millions of people. Let's see what they're doing today. Again, I can't know what they're doing today because we don't have that website that I want to release. The website where I can pay to see what life is like in Libya. Okay. But again, I don't know. People in Libya sometimes don't know what's going on. People in Ukraine don't know what's going on hundreds of kilometers away. But anyway, Libya is a failed state. And last year, let's see what happened. Imminent water shortages, gangs running over the place. I mean, look, even in our own backyard, we have gangs like the Sinaloa cartel and the drug gangs, right? The Zetas. I mean, we just stand by and look, we try to fight those gangs, but we mostly try to fight them over here. The drug war has exported all that violence to Mexico. So again, our policies, whether it's removal of Saddam and empowering then the Ba'athist generals join up with ISIS, and we're like, whoopsie, I guess now all these people, the Yazidis, all of them are threatened. We don't really care because it's us. And, you know, it seems that we care about 4 people in Libya, which is of course, 4 people are important. There are people. But what about the other millions? So I have a big problem with that. And here's the videos I wanted to play. The videos I wanted to play include by Obama interview. I would have loved to hear what Noam Chomsky thinks of this. Apologies. Looking for the video. Nuclear test, nuclear enrichment. No one's talking to other people. This is how they talk. This is how the president of the United States, a well-liked president, talks to the media, a well-respected media outlet, about US foreign policy that leads to war and destruction, in this case, in Syria. This is what they say. Notice how he has to defend himself and what he says to make himself look better.
A year ago, when we did this interview, there was some saber rattling between the United States and Russia on the Ukrainian border. Now it's also going on in Syria. You said a year ago that the United States, America leads, we're the indispensable nation. Mr. Putin seems to be challenging that lead.
We are the indispensable nation. We have to be there in every conflict. We're the world police. We have to help solve the conflict by getting involved, maybe arming some people with our great weapons industry and making sure that the conflict is solved. Well, their concern is not that ISIS, al-Nusra Front, and others are active in Syria, at least not this journalist. He is more concerned that Putin is challenging the fact that America is world police in this region. Why isn't America acting, doing more that they would be leading rather than Putin? This is 2016, 2014, something like that, when the Syrian conflict was getting underway.
Leadership.
In what way? Let's think about this.
Well, he's moved troops into Syria, for one.
Yeah.
He's got people on the ground.
Right.
Two, the Russians are conducting military operations in the Middle East for the first time since World War II.
So
because the Syrians asked them to come there because they were being attacked by al-Nusra Front, which incidentally was sponsored by the Saudis. And to some extent, perhaps, we helped a lot of these guys with the Iraq war. The Baathists, got out of power and they joined up with ISIS. And what about ISIS? What about the power vacuums? What about the Mujahideen that the United States helped to create? And of course, back then, the Saudis with the Wahhabi Islam and the Salafist Islam, right? They essentially helped create these radical factions that took on a life of their own. So who was attacking Syria? Who was attacking these Shiites? So Iran and Hezbollah came to help, and also Russia came to help in Syria because they were called there. But anyway, this is not the concern. The concern isn't to smash ISIS together and work together. The concern is penis measuring, it seems.
Arming the people that we are supporting.
So that's leading, Steve?
Arming the people that, bombing the people that we are supporting. That would be the moderate rebels, of course. But the Free Syrian Army, as Ben Swan and others talked about, was something that happened in 2011. Free Syrian Army wasn't even around at this point. It was mostly al-Nusra Front, or at least that's who got all the weapons in the end.
So let me ask you this question. When I came into office, Ukraine was governed by a corrupt ruler who was a stooge of Mr. Putin.
That's probably correct. Yanukovych was pretty much a stooge of Mr. Putin. But he was also someone who was democratically elected by Ukraine. Do subsequent presidents count as stooges of the United States? Probably not, and they shouldn't be. Ukraine is a democratic country, and for all its faults with corruption, as systemic corruption, it has a robust democracy that is able to usher in new presidents. But that doesn't mean that they're not under the control or influence of another country, especially a country that says, we will support you and don't worry, we'll help you. Just like the United States said to the Kurds, we'll help you if you help us against Saddam Hussein. And then abandon them, and then Trump abandoned them again to the Turks. Luckily, nothing bad happened there, but what were we going to do about that?
Syria was Russia's only ally in the region. And today, rather than being able to count on their support and maintain the base they had in Syria, which they've had for a long time, Mr. Putin now is devoting his own troops, his own military, just to barely hold together by a thread his sole ally.
And in Ukraine, Mr. President, he's challenging.
Look, that's the most important thing. He's challenging your leadership. He's basically describing how Russia's had a base there for a long time, and they could barely hold together their sole ally in the region. Seems like something that would be important to a country, China, United States, Russia, anyone. But he's using that as an example to prove himself that, you know what, we are leading. Look at that. They're barely holding together their last ally. That's us leading. You see, I don't get it. Citing negative things, or people are suffering, or things are barely holding on by a thread, is not the greatest example of leadership, but that's the main focus here. It's not about people being bombed. It's not about Homs, Syria, which was bombed by Russia, by the way, or the Yazidis that were attacked by ISIS. It's none of this. But this is what we need. We need citizen journalists to create footage like this. This is the only reason. Maybe this Associated Press. I don't know. This could be done with the house drone. This is way beyond Mariupol. Okay, seriously.
What if there was a secure place with lots of tough layers to get through? And even a separate
Seriously?
secure place to keep your most important stuff private.
Whoa, impressive.
If this is the kind of security you want, you can have.
Okay. This is what citizen journalists can do with private drones. This is way beyond even what we have in Mariupol. Okay, Russians and Syrian army have literally destroyed the entire city. The entire city. Or at least miles and miles and miles of it. The advertising is really annoying because it covers up so much, but this level of destruction, people can't just rebuild from this so easily. And I'm always suspicious of cuts where they show the same block over and over. This is not the same block. This is. Now, I don't know, maybe it looked like that before the war. I doubt it. But that's the extent of destruction. And of course, it's not just Homs, it's also Aleppo, right? And other cities. Aleppo destruction. This is what we should care about. But back then, okay, this is Aleppo. It looks a little better. There's some houses here that have been intact. This is showing like, I'm always like looking at the extent of the damage. Okay, there's just some city blocks of damage. Seems Homs is a lot worse even than Aleppo, but who knows? Again, we need to have the data. I would like to have a map made by other people on the ground. People in Syria, people around the internet should have a site like this that can then translate between Chinese, Belarusian, Ukrainian, everything, because then people from all over the world can come together seamlessly and discuss what happens. That's what Reddit did with the Boston Marathon bomber, others. They sometimes get it wrong, but the crowd is better than a CIA agent because somehow the wisdom of the crowd seems to be outperforming even trained analysts. Turns out that the crowd was consistently able to have better results than the pros. So I think that's important. Now let me show you the other videos that I was going to show Noam Chomsky, because I think, again, I wanted to confront him on a couple things that people asked me to confront him on. I didn't get a chance. This was towards the end. Chomsky seems to be on the side of the aggressor in two cases. One case was, well, no, let's put it this way. When NATO, which is not always defensive, because NATO attacked Yugoslavia, and NATO attacked Yugoslavia with no UN support. However, it is also true that during this war, there were a lot of war crimes, and the forces of the Slobodan Milosevic regime committed rape, killed many Albanian civilians, and expelled them during the war. During the war, however, this is the thing, is like Noam says that during the war, these atrocities escalated, which he's correct about. Every country seems to claim genocide before invading, before doing something. And that is also true of NATO. NATO did this. NATO bombing of, there we go. NATO bombing of Yugoslavia has a lot of similarities with the Russian bombing, in that they didn't have any, they claimed there's a genocide, bloodshed and ethnic cleansing of Albanians. The question is, how much was there, and did it justify an incursion? Yugoslavia's actions had already provoked condemnation by international organizations. I don't know if Ukraine's actions were had provoked condemnations by international organizations when they engaged in Donbass with the separatists there. However, we did have some international organizations condemning it. And again, I would have loved to get Noam Chomsky's. I would have loved to get Noam Chomsky's take on this. One moment. Ooh, where are you? Electronic Intifada. He likes that publication. Well, no. Here we go. So Haaretz is typically a left-leaning organization that criticizes the Israeli government. They hold their feet to the fire. And the Electronic Intifada was very happy to see this, these articles, and also republish them. Back then, human rights groups, activists, petitioned the court to cease Israeli arms exports to Ukraine, since some of these weapons reach neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine's security forces. Who's the victim here? Presumably the separatists and their families, right, in the Donbass region, the pro-Russians. Back then, okay, they're talking about how it's ironic that Israel's arming these right-wingers and different things. And of course, Electronic Intifada was really happy to put these images out back then. Okay, so human rights groups, condemnation, and so on has happened, but now we look back on it and we say, no, those are good, those are fine folks and whatever. You know, look, there's good people on all sides, right? Yugoslavia's refusal to sign Rambouillet Accords initially offered as justification for NATO's use of force. They attempted to gain authorization to the UN Security Council. They were opposed by China and Russia, who indicated they would veto such a measure. Of course, you have these two authoritarians versus liberal democracies. As a result, NATO launched its campaign without the UN approval, stating it was a humanitarian intervention. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly what Putin claimed happened when he invaded Ukraine. The UN Charter prohibits the use of force, except in the case of decision by the Security Council or self-defense, neither of which were present in this case. So NATO is not purely a defensive alliance. Who knows what they might do in the future? I think all sides are trying to do the right thing. NATO is trying to prevent ethnic cleansing and bloodshed. We went into Libya to remove Gaddafi because we said that there were reports of him murdering his own civilians from helicopters. I remember that myself. But turns out later that many of these rumors were never substantiated. So I don't know. You can look it up yourself. But the State Department admitted, yeah, we didn't really have that much evidence that we were found. Just like the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Or just like the evidence we swore we have that Assad gassed his own people. Saddam did. I know about Assad. So it seems sometimes very strange that, you know, these accusations of genocide are put forth, but really they're put forth to justify invasions. Because these bad things are happening, we got to act now. So is Libya better off? No. The other thing I wanted to talk about is precedent, historic precedent. So the Afghan war happened very interestingly. There was a legitimate government, the Afghanistan government. Without proper equipment and training, the Afghanistan government was unable to resist the opposition called the Mujahideen. And they asked for the aid of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union said, okay, we'll help you. We'll help stabilize your regime, just like Russia did recently in Kazakhstan, just like they did in, maybe they helped in Belarus. Who knows? I don't know, but this seems to be the case. So of course, the entry of the Soviet Union in the country caused an immediate increase in the presence of foreign involvement. Massive media campaigns against the Mujahideen who blended in with the local population. The military campaigns against them, supported by Russia, caused extensive destruction, local infrastructure, and death, causing the local population to side with the Mujahideen. Sounds a lot like Syria. And perhaps Yemen. Syria and Yemen are mirror opposites. We help the people against a brutal dictator. We call them the Free Syrian Army, and they're the good guys. We help the Saudi government against Yemen Houthi rebels. We call them terrorists, and we say that we're helping advance our national interest. Look, I mean, end of the day, doesn't matter what the narrative is. You got to stop the killing, the fighting. And so this is at least some hope. All right. So here are the videos I wanted to play. And so before the second hour is done, I can sort of show you where I see things headed. Like I said, I think we're going to clean up the grain. I think Russian fertilizer, nitrogen, and titanium, of all things, is used all over the world. 70% of the nitrogen, the fertilizer, is reliant on Russia for many of the industries. Something like, or 20% to 70%. Titanium is used for Boeing airplanes. It's so ironic. I don't understand it. Russia doesn't even make that much money from the titanium, but somehow they're like, yeah, we'll keep giving you titanium and you keep building your planes. But meanwhile, they revoked all the ability of Russia to fight planes. I just don't understand why Russia hasn't, like, if Russia wanted to be super malicious and evil around the world, they would just be like, no titanium for you, no fertilizer for you. And like, shit, that would really hurt a lot of countries. I think there are a lot of responsible people there almost saying like, dude, you're putting all these sanctions, but we're still going to ship you all the stuff that you actually need. And they're almost making it like, oh, you won't pay for our gas, then we won't sell you gas. But if you pay for it, we'll still send it to you. I don't know. I don't understand it. The other thing I don't understand about Russia is all these weapons are turnkey. Like, I give you a weapon, you can fire it, and pretty soon they'll be self-flying, self-driving. But right now, I still need a person to press the button. And what I have a problem with is if the United States gives these weapons to Ukraine, or Britain gives these weapons to Ukraine, of course, Ukraine is being decimated by the superior, let's say, Russian force, and they're so good at repelling a bigger force, just like Finland was, and mad respect to the Ukrainian army and armed forces for that. But keep in mind, all these weapons are exploding over the heads of Ukrainian civilians. So what I don't understand is, if you're Russia and countries are giving weapons to Ukraine, what difference does it make to you that they're not also sending a person to press the button? Aren't the weapons the most important thing, not the person? The person can't kill hundreds of thousands of people like this. Okay, weapons can. It is literally, guns don't kill people, people kill. No, these weapons kill people, whoever shoots them. So I don't understand why Russia is so passé about it. And like, okay, well, I guess they gave us the weapons. I mean, I guess it's because they're afraid of escalation. And that's good. That's good. We should have more cooler heads prevailing. So anyways, here's the videos I wanted to play. First of all, cooler heads prevailing is one thing. Nuclear proliferation is another. Iran is a signatory to the Nuclear Proliferation Act. However, there's a window of just 3 or 4 weeks to restore at least some of the monitoring that was being scrapped. They are doing the Saddam Hussein thing. They are expelling international. In June, Iran began removing essentially all the agency's monitoring equipment installed under 2015 deal. How is this good? That deal was awesome. I'm sorry, but just my personal opinion, having a lot of cameras, a lot of inspectors is better than not having them. How well are those sanctions working out for you? Sanctions on Russia, have they worked? It's 2020, it's July 22nd right now. Haven't worked. In fact, Russia's ruble is stronger than the European euro now. Who have they hurt, these sanctions? Number one. Number two, Iran, 30 years of sanctions. Okay, but this is the year they're going to work. And then, of course, there's the North Korea. Now, remember, not many people remember this, but back then, Bill Clinton negotiated what was called the Agreed Framework with the father of the now ruler of North Korea, Kim Jong-il. And so the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, promised they would not develop a nuke, but all that the United States had to do is essentially lower some sanctions and kind of ease up on the sanctions. Guess what? Clinton left office. The next administration, Bush, called it appeasement, called it too expensive to appease these guys. Surely sanctions will work, right? They got a nuke. Oh, not only did they get a nuke, but also Operation Orchard, or whatever you call it in Hebrew. Here's an article. They helped proliferate nuclear technology to Syria. Of course, this was never 100% confirmed that they were building this, but Israelis didn't take a chance. They bombed the shit out of a nuclear reactor that was supposedly a nuclear facility. White House and Central Intelligence Agency subsequently confirmed that the American intelligence had also indicated the site was. Who knows? Syria denies this. What's interesting, though, is Syria was very silent on Israel bombing this site. Didn't put out a statement. When Israel bombs an airport, they put out a statement, which they did during, well, several times. But when Israel bombs this area, nothing. Wonder why. Anyway, how great is it? Again, North Korea got a nuke. Sanctions didn't work. Oh, but this time with Iran, it's going to be different. Like, we have the world's most extensive, or had the world's most extensive nuclear inspection regime. And we were like, nah, we don't need that. We need sanctions. Well, now it's done. And by the way, the Saudis are pissed at us for trying to go back and make a deal again. They're not selling the oil for US dollars anymore. So congrats, Biden. That looks bad for you. They don't pick up the phone on you anymore. Having said that, they do now, again, they met, and Biden wants more oil to be pumped. I was going to mention one other positive thing, and I totally forgot. Forgot. There is one silver lining to all this, and that is that the amount of oil and fossil fuels and gas and so on is becoming more expensive. People are using less of it, which is great, because now we see wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, and many other things like nuclear energy, maybe nuclear fusion one day, flowing through electric cars. The cars are one of the only technologies that are locked into one type of fuel. Where's the free market in that? One type of fuel monopoly, the same monopoly that suppressed Tesla, denied him funding, because back then Edison, Tesla, they had electric cars built. There's Edison Museum, go look it up. But the battery technology sucked. Tesla was able to send electricity through distances and so on. They were so threatened by this, they shut off his funding. And for the next decades, they would bury any electric things. Who killed the electric car? If you watch this documentary on YouTube, who killed the electric car? They produced a pretty great electric car. People were buying it. Now they buried it. They recalled all the cars. They crushed them. This was mid-1990s. Why? Well, threatens the profits of big, I guess, oil. Again, where's the free market in this? Petrodollar warfare going to Iraq. Why would we be in the Middle East if not for that? So there's a lot of blood on our hands too with this. Yes, I am pretty happy if fossil fuels are more expensive. Look, there's short-term pain that is happening, and people need to get to work, which is why we should have done it a different way. We should have done it with the carbon tax and dividend, which is what they do in Alaska. Carbon tax and dividend. Basically, they tax at the point of emission, and then they collect these fees and give it to the people so they can afford to get to work. No more yellow vest protests. Alaska, permanent fund. Guess what? Every citizen of Alaska gets $2,000 a year. Because positive. Why? Because they have all this fuel. That's how they said, give it to the people rather than the government. So it's the world's biggest example of the UBI, universal basic income. You actually paid to be a resident, $1,600 per resident. That's pretty cool. Now, another thing is look at the Gini index, the index of inequality. So any leftist should care how income inequality in Alaska compares to other states. See this Gini coefficient? So it's consistently in the top two. Let's look at it. Now it's top three. All right. Gini coefficient 2019. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's now in the top 5. Utah, by the way, has some secret too. Maybe they give homes to the homeless for free. Who knows? But certainly that helps. Gini coefficient. Alaska used to be number 2 with tied with Utah all the time. Now I guess it's dropped to number 5. But I bet you the basic income has something to do with it. Having an extra cushion of $2,000 a month means you could take more risks. Anyway, so this is not good. This is not so good. Belarus asked for their nukes back. That's what I wanted to talk to Chomsky about. Let me play these videos to close it out. Before I play these videos, I'll just say a couple things. One is a proxy war happens when essentially large countries take advantage of sectarian strife within a country. Ukraine, like I said, 3 different groups. There was the pro-Russian groups, which sometimes even love the USSR and want to be in a union again with the United States. I mean, with the USSR, with Russia. And if you think of it, in some ways, that's actually maybe a not so bad idea in the sense that, can you imagine a war of New York versus New Jersey? It's unthinkable because they're part of the same union, right? I'm not saying there is no violence. There was the Holodomor during Stalin. In China, Mao Zedong starved the peasants also. But it seemed to be more of like a misguided national policy, just like we have domestically with the drug war and incarceration, maybe. But worse, because more like the Irish potato famine, which was explicitly to protect the property rights of landlords. Well, they went too much overboard with that. So you could be too capitalist or too socialist and have a famine. Not good. But that's not the same as having a war. Wars can cause a lot of more destruction. So proxy war, if you read it, it's essentially what it is. A proxy war is an armed conflict between 2 states or non-state actors which act at the instigation or on behalf of other parties that are not directly involved. In order for a conflict to be considered proxy war, there must be a direct, long-term relationship between external actors and the belligerents involved. belligerents in this case being Russia and Ukraine. The external actors being United States, Britain on the one hand, and Russia. I don't know, in this case, Russia is also the external actor. Russia has supported a proxy war. Let's talk about it like this. Since 2014, there was a proxy war between the separatists in the Donbass region and the neo-Nazi battalions, let's say, with Azov and Dnipro and all these guys. And they were shelling each other and killing each other. Now, that kind of died down. And it could have been completely eliminated if Zelensky was able to negotiate with them, get them to put down their arms, and Russia wouldn't sponsor the terrorists like these guys. Girkin led a group of militants into Ukraine where he participated in the siege of Slavyansk. During the battle, he increased his influence and ultimately became the de facto military commander of all separatist forces in the Donbass region, which was confirmed by the Prime Minister Alexander Borodai of DPR, who appointed him as official defense minister. Well, I mean, look, the American Revolution also was a bunch of, people against the crown, right? Treason and all this stuff. Back then they could do it. Today, I guess it's against rule of law. But again, these are international terrorists. I'm sure that George Washington and the founding fathers were considered terrorists by the crown. But regardless, if not for Girkin, and he says it himself, these militants would have lost. And they would have been like in Catalonia, and it would have been like the Kurds in Turkey, just like a referendum. We want to be part of Russia. Well, too bad. In some ways, that would have been a way better outcome. But given that he is in here, and given that this guy is the sole reason why this conflict is dragged on for so long, given that the two countries and presidents should have worked harder to make sure that make a peace agreement. But like I've shown with Noam Chomsky, Arestovich, he's like the war hawk in the administration, and others surrounding Zelensky, who I don't think was a war hawk at all. He wanted peace. But many people were like, let's get into NATO. Let's get away from Russia, because these groups are trying to deny the other everything. So Yanukovych put Tymoshenko in jail and denied the Ukrainian, the guys that speak Polish in the West and are Western leaning and European leaning. He denied the association agreement. That was stupid. Why, Yanukovych? What was so bad about having those guys also have an association with Europe? Let both sides have associations. No. And so he used Berkut to smash those guys and their uprising. And then, then Yatsenyuk came into power, which, by the way, the State Department was heavily involved with the brokering of power, which Obama admits in his interview. And they go the other way. They use Berkut to smash the uprisings of the other guys. Of course they would, though, because it's like territorial integrity, right? So you just need the politicians to make a deal. And instead, I personally spoke to them, and I'll show you. Like, I love having actual facts, actual people. And I can actually show you. So Arachamia, right? So this is what I wrote to him. If I could find them on this thing. It's Cyrillic. Hopefully he understands. David Brown. He goes by David Brown on Facebook. I wrote to him in Ukrainian. I told him, please do something. This was back in March 2nd, right after the invasion. They were going. I'm like, be serious, please. Slava Ukraini, but also like peace to Ukraine as well. And I'm like, great. You could read this yourself. You could stop the war. This is what, be creative. Wait a few years. The Russian government will change. A new leader will come in. You guys will get back everything, all your concessions. Anyway, I wrote him this, and he's like, thank you. I'm thinking my thoughts are similar. And I was very happy, but then he didn't actually read a lot of this. And people on his page were posting, I don't know if I could see it here. People on his page were like asking, begging him to make a peace deal. Not everybody, but enough people. And he was like, well, I'll try, man. The current leadership needs to understand that if they continue doing what they're doing, they risk the future of Ukrainian statehood. It was back in like obviously I condemn in the strongest terms Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Of course, like Vitalik and other people say, why don't you always use diplomacy first? Why not? Well, they'll tell you because there's a genocide in the Donbass region. And Zelensky with Bayraktar drones in 2021, all right, started winning. This was also another escalation. So this was let's do this before 2021 12:30. So this was before, this is all the results before. Ukraine angers Russia by buying Turkish drones. Ukraine using Turkish drones in Donbass conflict and self-defense. They stepped up the stuff on their side as well. Nobody cares about this anymore. Nobody cares about the reasons for massing forces. Now, if you go even further back to 2021, Russians massed forces before as well. So it goes back and forth. Both sides are escalating and saber rattling. But you know what? We all know that the politicians like Putin, Zelensky, Biden, all these guys will never go themselves to the war. We don't have that thing anymore where the kings ride into battle. Then fine, go ahead. And you know, we should have just the man-on-man combat, just few people, just figure it out. That's it. That's what they used to have. In fact, in some way, the Middle Ages the wars were actually nicer. In only one way. They were far more brutal, and there was far more rape and far more torture and dismemberment and just diseases. Like Native Americans also were slaughtered and so on. But in one way, they were slightly more humane, and that is they fought in the fields away from the civilians. So if you were a warrior, you went to the fields, you chose to go and defend and die. And then you came back and actually had polygamy, just like Russia had after World War II. Lots of polygamy, official, not official, because there's not enough men, a lot of women. So it's in the women's interest to have a man, you know, so they agree, fine, have that. That was throughout most of history. And that's why I think we're genetically program many men to be somewhat polyamorous, polygamous more than women. But regardless, in the Middle Ages, the war was over there. The civilians were behind these walls, and they were kind of like the women and children. Now, these guys are like, now let's just bomb in the cities. Boom, bomb. That's something that's worse than even in the Middle Ages. That's the only thing. Middle Ages were way more brutal. Society is actually way better now after the Geneva Conventions, after there's now a concept of war crimes. Back then it was like war, anything goes. Now it's war crimes. So I would love to have United States, Russia, and Ukraine support the International Court, basically the International Criminal Court. Would be great, but who supports it? The United States threatened the ICC when it said it'll investigate its actions in Afghanistan. Threatened it. Okay, pull its funding. Another thing, war crimes. People die in a war zone. They die from collateral damage versus dying from war crimes. Sure, there are always war crimes. And we need to understand that most people die not from the war crimes, but from collateral damage. And Chomsky had a debate with Sam Harris about this. And he said collateral damage is, in his view, even more immoral because you don't even consider the victim as a human being. Well, just like we talk about 4 Americans in Libya, but we don't talk about the millions of other people in Libya that have to actually live there. Or we talk about Khashoggi, but we don't talk about the other millions of people in Yemen that have to actually live there. So I think that it's important to care about other people. Okay, so war crimes, I just want to talk about this because, again, it's being used as a tool to perpetuate was explicitly using Ukraine as a buffer country. They're literally saying, we'll give them the weapons, so we fight the Russians over there, so we don't have to fight them over here. I mean, those are actually literal words that were said in 2019 by Schiff, who was prosecuting Trump. We fight the Russians over there, meaning Ukraine, so we don't have to fight them over here. I find that to be a staggering admission. Here, you know what? I'm just going to do this. Here we go. Finally. Okay. So let's play some of these videos in their own words. This is what they say in their own words. We fight. So we're going to, final topic is war crimes and using Ukraine, same way they used Afghanistan. So we are fighting Russia over there. Let's start with this. Now, again, Adam Schiff is just say that we're using Ukraine to fight Russia. Yeah, literally, this is, and in Europe, they say if Putin, Russia's their, Ukraine is their first line of defense against Russia. Like Russia's going to go and overrun Europe. Same as like the Molotov-Ribbentrop like pact, like Stalin, Hitler. They're just gonna
United
like,
States.
They're just gonna like overtake Europe for some reason, as opposed to like, yeah, okay, they're reacting to NATO. Yeah, like, okay, they're saying it's a genocide in the Donbass, but their real plan is to take Ukraine and then go further, take Poland, take all Eastern Europe, keep going until someone stops them with their, Maginot Line. No, this is what they say.
States aid Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here.
How nice for Ukraine, isn't it? All the weapons being sent to Ukraine are exploding over Ukrainian citizens. And if they explode in Russian cities, then we risk even more escalation with nuclear war. Do I think it's fair? No, I don't think it's fair. I think Russia should just stop fucking invading. But like, you have to be practical. Here's an example of practicality. There is no violence in Crimea right now. Those people are living peacefully. Would you support Ukraine bringing the violence to Crimea in order to retake the territory? Many people don't. Many people are practical. But if you put on your statist hat that Noam Chomsky used to say, the new atheists, like they still believe in the religion of the state, then you care deeply that the people in Crimea will have the Ukrainian flag instead of the Russian flag. And a lot of libertarians are like, dude, I just want to make sure that I have liberty. I can go to work the next day. I can have food. I can have my family. I don't care. Like literally, I live in the New York City, right? And let's say I had news tomorrow that Mexico retook Texas from the United States. Somehow they were able to do it. Would I risk my life, my family's life to go and make sure Texas is not flying a Mexican flag? As long as people live there well and there's free movement of people and I can go visit my family or whatever, which if I had in Texas, is good enough for me. I've seen enough of these videos to show that is pointless to fight for this timeline of national flags in Europe. Just remember, whatever you're fighting for will probably change in about 30 years anyway. Here's what it looks like. I'll just, here's what it looks like. imagine you were here and you're like, I really love my Holy Roman Empire. And I really love my Holy Roman Empire, and I just don't want it to be overtaken by these Turks or whatever. Like, okay, but as long as you have the freedoms and people can still live there, like here. And then check out the 20th century. You ready for this? Boom, 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 boom. Okay. So like, why would you die for this, kill for this? So in my opinion, it's more important for civilians not to be killed in senseless wars. But hey, what do I know? So that's the kind of thing that a libertarian gets accused of, like, oh, you're siding with the enemy, you're siding with the other side. Like, no, I just don't want any more of this. And this is what the Belarusian president says. He says, close ally of President Vladimir Putin, we must stop, reach an agreement, end this mess, operation and war in Ukraine. Let us stop, and then we'll figure out how to go on living. There is no need to go further. Further lies the abyss of nuclear war. There is no reason to go there. Well, this is what Trump says. Our nukes are better than their nukes. Because I worked on the nuclear program. And oh, he even said this. Yep, he said it in 2018. But he said it more seriously in an interview that I heard live. He basically said, at some point, this would never happen under me. I had a ton of nukes and I improved our nukes and we have better nukes. So bring it on, Russia. I think now he's being a little more like, that was maybe a joke. I don't know. Biden's joke was worse. It was like, this man should not be allowed to remain in power. I happen to think that the Russian president is fudging some of the elections, and his party's fudging a lot of those elections. And there has to be some more transparency. But for Biden to say that, obviously escalates the problem. So that guy Girkin, Russia's responsible for training that guy. And that's why the war in 2014 never ended. This one man is responsible for what's going on today. Mostly that one guy. This guy was trained by the School of the Americas, a wonderful institution helping to train essentially people who went on to be dictators and terrorists. Because we also, well, it's Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation. Training center for people like Girkin, essentially. Illustrious graduates include people who, like this guy, Noriega, who went on to take over Panama. And then later we invaded Panama to take him out. This is another thing we did. We helped arm rebels in Syria. We helped arm rebels in Nicaragua against the Contras, against the Sandinista government and the Iran-Contra affair. On the other hand, NATO helped to bomb Yugoslavia because it also claimed a genocide there. There might have been ways to resolve the situation. This was one of the best resolutions because the war ended quickly and the government was not, how do we put it? Not decimated like in Iraq. This is as many civilians were killed. It's bad, but it could have been a lot worse if Russia had supported Yugoslavia with endless weapons. Here's another example. Russo-Georgian War, almost the exact analog of the Ukrainian war. 2008, NATO says Georgia can join NATO. Russia reacts later that year with two breakaway republics. Sound familiar? Abkhazia and Ossetia, South Ossetia. Apparently North Ossetia is part of Russia. No? Yes? Looks like it is. But South Ossetia is part of Georgia. So it seems they do have a separate ethnic identity and they're on the border of Russia. So they ask Russia for help. Help us, Russia. We want to become independent of Georgia. How much of that is astroturfed by Russia? I don't know. So then Georgia starts attacking them. Russia interferes. intervenes and starts invading Georgia. Luckily, though, this didn't last for very long because, so pretty much 2 breakaway republics, Russia goes through them and starts invading Georgia. Like, here are the lines in which they're invading. Russian Black Sea Fleet. Does that sound familiar? That's Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. Well, this is what happened. Russia falsely accused Georgia of committing genocide, sound familiar, and aggression against South Ossetia, launched a full-scale land, air, and sea invasion of Georgia, including its undisputed territory, referring to it as a peace enforcement operation. I don't know who's editing Wikipedia here, but it's obviously, peace enforcement operation, use of military force to compel peace. Well, their narrative is we're helping against a genocide. Okay, here's the point. Regardless of freaking narratives, they've temporarily occupied these Georgian cities, holding on to these areas beyond the ceasefire. Why was there a ceasefire? Because Nicolas Sarkozy, the president of France, personally negotiated a ceasefire agreement on 12th of August. So the war started when? The war started on the 1st. 12 days later, it was over. Where's Georgia today? It's been 14 years. It's doing okay. Where is Ukraine today? Well, there were peace agreements. They called them off. After Boris Johnson's visit to Kiev, no more peace agreements with Russia. We got to defeat Russia. Where have we heard that before? Here's where. How is this any different? This is what the US generals said to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Let me put this. There's the famous photo of Reagan meeting with the Mujahideen. And this is what Brzezinski said back then. He was the envoy. This is what he said to the Mujahideen against the USSR back then, Russia slash.
U.S. National Security Advisor Brzezinski flew to Pakistan to set about rallying resistance. He wanted to arm the Mujahideen without revealing America's role. On the Afghan border near the Khyber Pass, he urged the soldiers of God to redouble their efforts.
We know of their deep belief in God, and we are confident that their struggle will succeed. That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
The rhetoric sounds awesome, doesn't it? Result?
The purpose of coordinating with the Pakistanis will be to make the Soviets bleed for as much and as long.
Oh, that sounds very familiar. Tim Iverson had a wild theory that Hillary wanted to make Putin bleed. Here's the thing. There is a lot of that. Maybe it's not Hillary, but it's certainly the military-industrial complex.
Kim, what's on your radar?
Well, what is going on with this war in Ukraine? Should have been over by now through negotiations. Putin's demands have been mostly straightforward and
Yeah, well, she's over. She thinks it's mostly straightforward demands, and look, it's only this.
many think they're doable, and some even believe them to be fairly reasonable. Most importantly, he hasn't changed them since this war began. He's consistently told the various leaders in China, France, Israel, Turkey, and others what he wants, and the goalpost hasn't moved. His main demand is for Ukraine to change its constitution from how it's currently written, asserting its desire to join NATO, to instead stating it will never join. Zelensky has already conceded that
Zelensky can't do it because in order for Zelensky to himself do it, the people have to change the constitution. It's a very strange thing to put in your constitution that you're going to join NATO. And to change it, they would need a referendum, which the people could just say, screw Russia, we want to join NATO. Zelensky can't do anything about that. The other way you could do it is call a special session and spend 9 months trying to have the elites do it. Well, the Verkhovna Rada could just ignore Zelensky. either way, Zelensky isn't able to simply remove such a thing so easily from the constitution. So that's one problem.
Ukraine will not join NATO, but Putin wants it in the constitution. He wants Ukraine to undergo a disarmament process, which Russia is currently.
By the way, consider that you want to change another country's constitution. That's like huge meddling in their politics, even though it's strange. The other side, that NATO joining a defensive alliance is in the constitution, but public has spoken. But they also spoke to elect Zelensky on an overwhelming mandate of peace. So either way, I feel like neither of the public's, none of what the public is asking for actually comes to pass. But it's being used by the media and the politicians who have their own plans, for war, etc. And public's just there to wait for the bombs to fall on them, because they don't want to kill other people. They don't want to personally kill Russians or the other. I mean, maybe now they do, but before they just wanted peace. And so do many Russians, and so do most people in the United States. And that's why these people are considered, how do you not support the war effort? It's always the same.
Currently doing violently, but he requests that they instead undergo the destruction of the weapons themselves. He wants protection for the Russian language in Ukraine. In certain parts of the country, the Russian language has been forbidden in the public sector, even in areas where the majority of the residents speak Russian as their primary language.
Ukraine denies that the Russian language was forbidden. I'm not going to go into this because I'm not an expert on it, but Kim does investigate these things. She went to Israel. She went to a lot of places where she personally tries to verify this information. Regardless, these are not things you're supposed to be killing and raping people over.
Putin also says he wants denazification. And
yeah, that's the worst messaging ever.
What that means is removing from the government and the military the various openly ultra-nationalist people organizations.
And where is it going to end? It's like that guy in the Philippines who got elected. What's his name? The president. Oh, okay. Drug war president. I forgot his name. He promised to personally be responsible for killing Duterte, 100,000 drug dealers. Oh, well, he's just killing the drug dealers. That's perfectly cool. That's a deaths of 12,000 Filipinos. Looks like that guy's underperforming because he personally promised to kill Duterte, 100,000 drug dealers. There we go. Oh, even vows to kill 3 million drug addicts. Wow. Really? I think this may be a little overkill by the Guardian. If this is true. He literally said this. Man, Bolsonaro and Duterte and those guys are unbelievable. So that's what we have. So basically, a lot of the things that Putin says, oh, it's just denazifying. Great. We're going to trust you, Putin. It's just the Nazis. Yeah. It's just killing just the Nazis. So this whole thing, you got to understand, it's a political class of people. And it's just, they are getting the regular people, something. They are just putting them in wars, and the regular people have to fight these wars and be deprived of everything just so these politicians can have their egos massaged and not have to agree or concede to anything. Yay, look at me, I didn't concede anything. Whoopsie, I lost part of my country and people are dying. Great. Anyways, Catalan and Kurdish referendums are part of a growing number of separatist movements. It's 2017. They both voted for independence. Didn't go anywhere. So the solution that Noam Chomsky and I advocate is self-determination. Hong Kong votes for self-determination. China has to respect it. Imagine that. That would take a lot of effort on the part of the United Nations, but it's worth it. It's really worth it. Then I would imagine that a lot of places would get some self-determination for a few years. They'd vote again, and they would vote to rejoin. Britain did it. And probably figuring out maybe it's not so great. Maybe it is great. Who cares? But don't have wars over this. Okay. The Pope and many leftists, if leftists are watching this, you'll find out many fellow leftists are blaming NATO for what's happening in Ukraine. I'm talking about essentially here, Pope Francis. Pope Francis has come out and said something like, he literally said NATO is barking, dogs are barking at the USSR, I'm going to say, because that's what NATO was supposed to be against USSR, but it's really Russia. These dogs are barking. And how did he put it? Basically, he blames NATO for a lot of the stirring up of people, kind of like how we promised the Kurds that we're going to help against Saddam.
Blood and, talking about Ukraine's right to self-defense, which of course they have the right. No, I've never asserted they don't have the right. I don't think anyone's ever asserted they don't have the right to defend themselves. I think the question is, should we be the ones supplying the weapons, and should they defend themselves rather than negotiate, is, I think, a question that many of us have asked. But now the Pope taking a more firmer stance, saying this is NATO's fault. So before he was kind of saying it wasn't really putting blame. I mean, he put the blame on Russia, saying Russia's invading, but even without really fully blaming Russia. So he did it in a very kind of fine line way, but now full on coming out and saying NATO, that is like the big no-no. You're not allowed to blame the West for Russia's aggression.
Yeah, that's the point. The US is world police. You know that nice movie, Team America, World Police, great movie. US is world police. So if the police does something, kills people, whatever, well, that's the police. We're keeping law and order. But if another country does anything even remotely like 1% of what we do or 10% of what we do, right away, it's like, oh, sanctions, which by the way, never work, and sometimes lead to even worse things. But somehow, hey, Russia's not world police. So if they go and do things we do, they're terrible and monstrous. Yes, invasions are bad. Diplomacy, good. US should try that. Anyways, but in the US, they have an interesting dynamic. There's two parties, and each time the administration changes, they say mistakes were made by the previous administration. Like, let's start with the Native Americans. They say that white men speak with forked tongue because you say one thing, do other thing. Yeah, they kind of took over all their land. All the treaties were kind of, the next administration negated it, like with Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears, right? What happened? Well, Jefferson said you can integrate into society, Indian Removal Act. Well, great. So Jefferson said, all you have to do is dress like white man, do things like white man, and you'll be fine. Well, the 5 civilized tribes turn out not fine. Apparently, Andrew Jackson, next administration, goes, got to leave these lands anyway, because we need your land. Indian removal, ethnic cleansing was gradual, occurring over a period of nearly 2 decades. Still. So anyways, and then you got the expulsion and Trail of Tears, all the way up to the Iran deal. And let's do the deal with Kim Jong-il, agreed framework. The agreed framework. Kim Jong-il said, okay, won't have a nuke. Great. The United States said, after the agreement was signed, US Congress changed to the Republican Party, which did not support the agreement. What a surprise. So some Republican senators were strongly against the agreement, regarding it as appeasement. So result, they got nukes. From 1996, Congress provided funding, though not always sufficient amounts, but later, consequently, some of the agreed transitional oil supplies were delivered late. Fine, but at least they were doing something. Some analysts believe North Korea agreed to freeze primarily because of the US agreement to phase out economic sanctions that have been in place. But because of congressional opposition, US failed to deliver on this part of the agreement. Great, okay, Iran. Open letter to Iran by Congress. They were open for once, honestly. Tom Cotton's letter with 32 colleagues. Senator Cruz letter. Here we go. I'm sorry. My bad. Tom Cotton, 46 fellow senators, open letter to the leaders of the Islamic Republic called Do not trust us. We are the United States, and you don't know how our system works. One party is going to make a treaty with you. The next party will tear up that treaty because on technicalities. It has come to our attention that while observing your nuclear negotiations with our government, that you may not fully understand our constitutional system. Thus, we are writing to bring to your attention the features of our constitutional system, the power to make binding international agreements in a different character of federal offices, our checks and balances, which you should seriously consider as negotiations progress. They're trying to be serious, but they're literally saying, under our Constitution, while the president negotiates international agreements, Congress plays a significant role of ratifying them. In the case of a treaty, the Senate must ratify by 2/3 vote. A so-called congressional executive agreement requires a majority vote in both the House and the Senate, which, because of procedural rules, effectively means a 3/5 vote in the Senate. Anything not approved by Congress is a mere executive agreement. Yes, that's true. It's our checks and balances. Second, the offices of our Constitution have different characteristics. See, they were being unusually honest in this case, as opposed to the agreed framework. Have different characteristics. For example, the president may only serve 2 4-year terms. Who are they speaking to? They're speaking to the leaders of the Islamic Republic of Iran, who clearly didn't do their homework on the United States. Whereas senators may serve an unlimited number of 6-year terms, as applied today. For instance, President Obama will leave office in January 2017, hint, hint. While most of us will remain in office far beyond then, perhaps decades. Not so subtle. While what these constitutional provisions mean is that we will consider any agreement regarding your nuclear weapons program that is not approved by the Congress as nothing more than an executive agreement between President Obama and the Ayatollah. The next president could revoke such an agreement, which he did, at the stroke of a pen, and future Congresses could modify the terms of the agreement at any time. Well, hey, even the Supreme Court is able to essentially override its previous decisions like Roe v. Wade. So why not the Congress? We hope this letter enriches your knowledge of our constitutional system. Thank you, United States, and promotes mutual understanding and clarity as nuclear negotiations progress. An open letter to basically delegitimize try to defeat any attempt at any agreement to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. How is that going? How is that going? Where is Iran here? We've already seen this. Iran is going towards a nuclear weapon, but is denying, of course. Galloping ahead, the International Energy Agency. This guy says, literally, this was what, in March? Nope, this is literally in July. This is literally today. Galloping ahead. International Atomic Energy Agency has very limited visibility on what's happening. Whose fault is that? Iran began removing essentially all the agency's monitoring equipment installed in 2015 nuclear deal with world powers, just like the Paris Accords and others. And it's just not nice for the United States. Why bother? How is this going to be different than North Korea? You tell me. Is it hard for their government to sell the idea that we have enemies out there that would like to see us being destabilized, would like to see a regime change, would like to see your friendly government that you love so much disappear? And, some people love their leaders, especially if they're Islamic. So there you go. Last thing is that we mostly care about wars in Europe. We mostly care if it's Ukraine because it's kind of Eastern Europe. Where is the talk of Ethiopia, one of the biggest crises right now? Where's the talk of Yemen? Oh, that's old news. That's yesterday's news. Well, during the Paris attacks, most countries flew the French flag. That same day, same number of people, pretty much 130 people, unfortunately, were killed, 150 people in a stadium by the same group, ISIS. ISIS attacked Paris. Another ISIS group attacked Beirut. But somehow, not many people cared about Lebanon, Beirut. Where's the colors of Lebanon? So that's just one small example, right? Big examples include Libya. Millions of people are suffering. We care about 4 Americans, of course, and Syria, and of course Yemen, but we care about Khashoggi, who's not even an American citizen. Trump was like, "Oh, he's not even a citizen." Oh, so I'll leave with frank admissions of the U.S. presidents themselves about their own decisions. Essentially, one would be Trump. Trump says Saudi Arabia, it's billions of dollars that we're giving them in weapons, and they're giving us all this stuff. Why would we stop that just for one guy, Khashoggi? Well, the answer should be, it shouldn't be for Khashoggi. It should be how those weapons are being used in Yemen. No, none of that. U.S. Saudi SEAL deal worth nearly $100 billion. Weapons, my God, $110 billion over 10 years. Okay, beautiful, wonderful. So that's the weapons deal. And Trump was very happy. This was, by the way, under Trump, right? And in his own words, this is what he says. He's like, dude, that's a good business deal. It creates a lot of jobs. Why would we not do it? He keeps saying, and he kept exaggerating, the 110 billion, I believe, is the largest order ever made. 450,000 jobs is the best equipment in the world. Then he says 500,000 jobs. Like, this is what they care about, is the difference in the jobs number that he cites. That's what they care about. The jobs in creating weapons, killing people. What kind of a job? What, Tony Stark would be ashamed of you. While also expanding opportunities for American companies in the region, potentially supporting tens of thousands of new jobs in the United States. Thank you, weapons manufacturers. You're amazing. We could use those weapons in so many conflicts around the world. And here we go, is Bush in his own words. Well, let's do Trump in his own words, and then do Bush.
Very $450 billion worth of things ordered from a very rich country, Saudi Arabia. 600,000 jobs, maybe more than that. And it would be very hurtful to this country if we said, oh, we're not going to sell it to you. So there are other things we can do, but I would certainly make that recommendation to Congress. But I will very much listen to what Congress has to say. I do hope that they'll be able to.
It's amazing. He's openly admitting that it's all about the Benjamins. It's also about a lot of it. Wow, 110 billion of them. And by the way, he's going to listen to Congress very, very intently. Just like when the subpoenas came in and he said, don't listen to Congress, don't go and testify about the Ukrainian call, which was, in my opinion, far smaller than anything that's really going on in the world.
See the way clear to take, to make these products, which.
But that's what they impeach him for.
Talking about almost every state in the union is affected because it's the largest order ever given. I did this.
Yes, your business model depends on blowing people up. Thank you for creating all of that economic activity.
I went to Saudi Arabia first, and a large part of the reason was they agreed to do this. They agreed to spend $450 billion on.
All right, I don't think we need to listen too much more. We just want to have Jon Stewart as an antidote, and then George W. Bush. George W. Bush is going to close it out for us. So here's Jon Stewart talking about, in 2014, talking about automatics for the people. I hope I don't get Comedy Central flagging me for this. Automatics for the people. Here we go. Fair use commentary. Anyone? I'd do about 30 seconds of this. Let's go. Here's Jon Stewart in 2014, realizing that the United States has sent a lot of weapons to that region. And he wonders, back in 2014, whether that could lead to anything bad in, say, Yemen or any other country. So after watching these wonderful advertisements, we are going to get to the actual hopefully, program. Come on, advertisements. Here we go. Love this part. Better. All right, you got the point. So we've done that. 2014, we got started the Yemen crisis. All right, but the funniest thing of all, funnier than Mr. John Stewart, is this. Let's listen to former President George W. Bush. W. Talking about
contrast.
Talking about the contrast between
Russian elections are
Russian.
contrast.
I'll let him just say it in his own words. Here you go.
Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq. Anyway.
Everyone laughs.
75.
You're 75. But back when you did it, you were a little younger. But hey, I mean, listen, man. What's a few dead Iraqis between friends, huh? Anyways, between Dick Cheney perfectly predicting this, or Arestovich perfectly predicting the war in Ukraine, or the Bush gaffe over here, I'm just saying, like, can we just have politicians that don't want war? Is it possible to have Putin and Zelensky get together? Is it possible for all the countries in the world to support the peace agreement and see movement towards peace as positive and get people like John Bolton out of governments? Can we do that? While we're at it, perhaps we can cooperate on other things like shipping grain, not destroying the environment as much as we are. Maybe we can even get electric cars. Anyway, I still have hope for the future. This was a great 3 hours. I didn't expect to go on for this long, but I hope that this was informative. And if you have any comments or you want to get on the show, you want to talk about issues in the world, I'm very happy to. So leave a comment below and see you on the next one. Thank you.